The year was 1827, and in the quiet English village of Polstead, Suffolk, something terrible was about to happen. Something that would shake the very foundations of rural Victorian society and become one of the most famous murder cases in British history. But this wasn't just any murder. This was a crime that would be solved not by detectives or constables, but by something far more mysterious, a mother's recurring dream that refused to let the dead rest in peace. Let me take you back to a time when England was changing. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping cities, but in villages like Polstead, life moved at the same slow pace it had for centuries. Farmers worked the land their fathers and grandfathers had worked. Everyone knew everyone else's business. Reputation was everything, and scandal could destroy a family's standing in the community forever. It was in this world of rigid social codes and whispered gossip that Maria Marten lived, breathed, and ultimately died. Maria was born in 1801, the daughter of Thomas Marten, a mole catcher by trade. Now, you might not know what a mole catcher did, so let me paint you a picture. Thomas Marten's job was to trap and kill the moles that burrowed through farmers' fields, damaging crops and creating hazards for livestock. It was honest work, but it wasn't prestigious. The Martens were working class, respectable enough, but far from wealthy. They lived in a small cottage, made do with what they had, and like everyone else in Polstead, they attended church on Sundays and minded the opinions of their neighbors. Maria herself was, by all accounts, an attractive young woman. Contemporary descriptions call her lively, spirited, with dark hair and bright eyes. She had energy, charm, the kind of personality that drew attention in a small village where not much happened from one day to the next. But Maria had something else too, something that marked her in the eyes of the community. She had a past. By 1826, Maria had already borne a child out of wedlock. The child's father had been another man, and though the details remain unclear, the child had not survived. In the harsh judgment of early 19th century England, this made Maria damaged goods. She was, as they would have whispered behind their hands, a woman of questionable virtue. Now, we must be careful here not to judge Maria by the cruel standards of her time. Today, we understand that a woman's worth is not determined by whether she has had children in or out of marriage. We recognize the double standards that existed, how men could have affairs with impunity while women were shamed and ostracized for the same behavior. But in 1827, in Polstead, those modern understandings didn't exist. Maria was marked, her reputation was tarnished, and this would make her vulnerable to a man who saw her not as a person deserving of respect, but as someone he could use and discard. That man was William Corder. William Corder was born in 1803, the son of a farmer with land and a certain degree of local standing. The Corders were not aristocracy, not by any stretch, but they were comfortable. They had property, they had workers, they had, in the language of the time, prospects. William should have had a good life ahead of him, but from an early age, he showed signs that something was wrong. He was known throughout Polstead as deceitful, untrustworthy, the kind of man who would take shortcuts, tell lies, make promises he had no intention of keeping. He had a history of minor crimes. Forgery was one of them, creating false documents for personal gain. This wasn't petty theft or a moment of youthful foolishness. This was calculated dishonesty, the kind that suggested a deeper moral corruption. And there was something else, something darker that hung over William's past like a shadow. One of his brothers had died in a shooting accident. William had been present when it happened. Nothing was ever proven. No charges were ever filed. But people talked. They wondered. They looked at William differently after that, even if they couldn't quite say why. This was the man who began an affair with Maria Marten in 1826. We don't know exactly how it started. Perhaps William saw Maria as an easy target, a woman whose reputation was already compromised and who might be grateful for the attention of a farmer's son. Perhaps Maria, desperate to restore some respectability to her life, saw William as a chance for a fresh start. Whatever drew them together, the relationship followed a depressingly predictable pattern. Maria became pregnant. In 21st century Britain, this would be, at most, an inconvenience. There would be no shame, no scandal, no threat to anyone's livelihood or standing. But in 1827, an illegitimate child was a catastrophe. For Maria, already marked by her past, it could mean complete social ruin. She might never be able to marry. Her family might cast her out. She could end up destitute, begging on the streets or trapped in a workhouse, those brutal institutions where the poor were essentially imprisoned and worked to death. The child was born sometime in early 1827, and then, tragically, the baby died in infancy. Infant mortality was common in those days. Before modern medicine, before anyone understood about germs or antibiotics or proper nutrition. But the death of the child didn't solve William and Maria's problem. The fact of the pregnancy was known. The gossip had already spread through Polstead like wildfire. Everyone was talking. Everyone was judging. William told Maria they needed to get married. He said it was the only way to silence the gossip, to restore her reputation, to give them both a fresh start. But there was a problem. William claimed his family disapproved. They didn't want him marrying Maria, a woman they considered beneath his station, a woman with a scandalous past. So William proposed a solution. They would elope. They would leave Polstead secretly, travel to London, get married there without his family knowing, and then return as husband and wife, presenting everyone with a fait accompli. Maria, desperate and vulnerable, believed him. This is where the story takes its darkest turn, where William's lies became something far more sinister than mere deception, because William Corder never intended to marry Maria Marten. He intended to kill her. On the evening of May 18, 1827, William came to Maria with final instructions. They were leaving that very night, but she needed to be careful. They needed to avoid being seen leaving together, needed to evade his family and the village gossips. So Maria was to dress in men's clothing, a disguise that would let her slip through the streets of Polstead without being recognized. She was to gather her belongings, but not too many, just what she could carry easily. And she was to meet him at the Red Barn. The Red Barn. This is where our story gets its name, and it's worth taking a moment to describe this place because it would become one of the most notorious locations in Victorian England. It wasn't anything special, really, just a barn, a large wooden structure with a distinctive red-tiled roof that made it easy to spot across the fields. It belonged to William's family, stood on their land, was used to store grain and hay and farming equipment. It was isolated, set apart from other buildings, surrounded by empty fields. The perfect place, William must have thought, for what he was planning. Maria Marten left her father's cottage on the evening of May 18, 1827. She was dressed in men's clothes, carrying a small bundle of belongings. She told her family she was meeting William, that they were eloping to London, that they would write soon with news of their marriage. Her father, Thomas, her stepmother, Anne, they watched her go. They had their doubts, their worries, but what could they do? Maria was a grown woman. She had made her choice. They could only pray that William Corder would do right by her. Maria walked across the fields to the Red Barn. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the Suffolk countryside. She pushed open the barn door, stepped inside, looked around for William in the dim light, and that is the last time Maria Marten was ever seen alive. What happened inside the Red Barn that night? We can only piece it together from the evidence that would later be uncovered. William Corder shot Maria Marten. He used a pistol, fired a single bullet that entered through her left eye socket, killing her almost instantly. Why? Perhaps she confronted him about the marriage, demanded to know when they were leaving for London. Perhaps she finally realized he had been lying to her all along. Perhaps William simply decided it was easier to kill her than to deal with the ongoing complications of their relationship. Whatever the reason, he pulled the trigger, and then he had a body to dispose of. William dug a shallow grave right there in the Red Barn, underneath some loose floorboards. It wasn't a careful burial, not the kind where someone tries to hide a crime properly. It was hasty, desperate, the work of a man who just wanted the problem to go away. He covered Maria's body with dirt, replaced the floorboards, left the barn and went home. And then he began to lie. Oh, how William Corder lied. He lied with a skill and persistence that was almost impressive in its audacity. When Thomas Marten asked about Maria, William had his story ready. They had eloped, just as planned. They had traveled to London, found a minister, gotten married. Maria was now Mrs. Corder, and she was happy and well, living in Ipswich. Or was it Yarmouth? William's story changed depending on who was asking and when. Thomas wanted to see his daughter. William said that wasn't possible right now. Maria was embarrassed about the circumstances of their marriage. She was worried about facing the village gossips. She would visit soon, but she needed time. Weeks passed, then months. Thomas kept asking. Anne, Maria's stepmother, was growing increasingly worried. William produced letters, pieces of paper he claimed were from Maria, reassuring her family that she was fine, promising to visit soon, asking them not to worry. These letters were forgeries. William had written them himself, imitating Maria's handwriting as best he could. To Thomas and Anne, reading these letters by candlelight in their small cottage, the words seemed like their daughter. The handwriting looked right. The sentiments sounded like something Maria would say. They had no reason to suspect that William would go to such elaborate lengths to deceive them. After all, What would be the point? If Maria was dead or had left him, surely he would just say so. But William had killed Maria, and every lie, every forged letter, every reassurance he offered to her increasingly anxious family was part of an elaborate cover-up. He was buying himself time, keeping suspicion at bay, hoping that eventually people would simply stop asking questions. And he might have gotten away with it, except for Anne Marten's dreams. This is the part of the story that seems to belong more to Gothic fiction than to real historical events. But it is documented. It is true. It happened exactly as the records describe. Anne Marten began having nightmares several months after Maria's disappearance. In these dreams, she saw the Red Barn. She saw its distinctive red-tiled roof, its weathered wooden walls, and she saw Maria, her stepdaughter, buried beneath its floor. The first time Anne had the dream, she dismissed it. It was just anxiety, she told herself, worry about Maria manifesting in her sleep. But the dream came back, again and again, night after night. She would wake in the dark hours before dawn, her heart pounding. The image of that barn burned into her mind. Maria was there. Maria was calling out to her. Maria was beneath the floorboards of the Red Barn, and she needed to be found. Anne told Thomas about the dreams. He, like many men of his time, was skeptical of such things. Dreams were just dreams, products of an overstimulated imagination, not sources of reliable information. But Anne was insistent. The dreams were so vivid, so specific, so persistent. She could describe exactly where in the barn Maria was buried. She could see the loose floorboards, the shallow grave beneath. Finally, worn down by his wife's certainty and his own growing suspicions about William's constantly changing stories, Thomas Marten decided to investigate. On April 19, 1828, nearly a year after Maria had disappeared, he walked across the fields to the Red Barn. It was a cloudy day, cool for spring, with a wind blowing in from the east. Thomas brought a spade with him. He wasn't quite sure what he was looking for, wasn't quite sure he believed in prophetic dreams, but he had to know. He entered the barn. The interior was dim, dusty, smelling of old hay and wood rot. Farm equipment lay scattered around, rusted plows and broken tools. Thomas looked at the floor, examining the floorboards. Some of them, in the area Anne had described from her dreams, looked loose, disturbed, as if someone had recently lifted them and then replaced them. Thomas began to dig. He didn't have to dig deep, just a foot or so beneath the surface. His spade struck something that was not earth, something that made him stop, his hands shaking, his heart racing. He cleared away more dirt, working faster now, dreading what he was about to find, but unable to stop. There, in a shallow grave beneath the floor of the Red Barn, was the decomposed body of a woman. The remains were in terrible condition after nearly a year in the ground, but there was enough left to identify. The clothing was Maria's. Thomas recognized the dress, the shawl, the shoes. The hair, dark and matted with earth, was Maria's hair. And there, in the skull, clearly visible, even in the dim light of the barn, was a bullet hole through the left eye socket. Thomas Marten had found his daughter, and he knew without any doubt that she had been murdered. The discovery of Maria's body in the Red Barn sent shockwaves through Polstead and beyond. This wasn't just a missing person case anymore. This was murder, cold-blooded and premeditated, carried out by a man who had then spent months lying to the victim's family, forging letters in her name, constructing an elaborate fiction to cover his tracks. The authorities immediately began searching for William Corder. But William was no longer in Polstead. He was no longer in Suffolk. He had in fact left months earlier, telling people he was going to London on business. What he had actually done was start an entirely new life, abandoning his old identity as thoroughly as he had abandoned Maria's body in that barn. Police tracked him to London, and what they found there was almost absurd in its audacity. William Corder was living under an assumed name, recently married to a woman he had met through a newspaper advertisement. That's right, a newspaper ad. One of those personal columns where lonely people sought companionship. William had placed an ad describing himself as a gentleman of means seeking a respectable wife. A woman had responded. They had courted briefly, they had married, and now they were running a boarding school for girls. Can you imagine? A murderer, a man who had shot his previous lover in the face and buried her in a barn, was now in charge of educating young women. His new wife had no idea who he really was, what he had done, the lies he had built his entire life upon. On April 23, 1828, police knocked on the door of William Corder's London home. When he answered, they arrested him on suspicion of the murder of Maria Marten. His new wife, shocked and horrified, watched as her husband of just a few months was led away in chains. William was transported back to Suffolk to stand trial. And what a trial it was. The case had captured public imagination like nothing before it. This was before mass media in the modern sense, before television or radio or even widespread newspaper circulation in rural areas. But news of the Red Barn murder spread through the country like wildfire. Everyone was talking about it. Everyone had an opinion. The trial began in August 1828, held at Bury St. Edmunds, the county town of Suffolk. The courtroom was packed with spectators, every seat filled, people standing in the aisles and crowding around the doors to catch a glimpse of the proceedings. Outside, thousands more gathered in the streets, waiting for news, discussing the case, debating William's guilt or innocence. The evidence against William Corder was overwhelming. There was Maria's body, identified by her father and other witnesses who recognized her clothing and belongings. There was the bullet hole in her skull, clear evidence that this was no accident. There was a pistol that matched the type that had killed Maria, a pistol that witnesses confirmed William had purchased shortly before the murder. There were the forged letters, clearly written in William's handwriting, not Maria's. There were his constantly changing stories about where Maria was and why she couldn't visit her family. And there was the simple, damning fact that Maria's body had been found buried on William's family's property, in a barn he had access to, at a location he had specifically told Maria to meet him. William's defense attorney did his best, but there really wasn't much he could work with. William's story, such as it was, kept changing. First, he claimed complete innocence, saying he had no idea what had happened to Maria. Then, confronted with the evidence, he changed his story. He admitted to being at the Red Barn with Maria on the night of May 18th. He admitted that she had died there, but he claimed it was an accident. They had argued, he said. Maria had become emotional, distraught. She had grabbed a pistol, whether to threaten him or to harm herself. William wasn't clear. The gun had gone off accidentally. Maria had been shot. William, panicking, had buried her body to avoid being accused of murder. Nobody believed him. The bullet wound was too precise, too deliberate. The subsequent cover-up was too elaborate. The forged letters, the lies to Maria's family, the flight to London, and the creation of a new identity. None of this was the behavior of a man who had witnessed a tragic accident. This was the behavior of a murderer desperately trying to escape justice. The jury deliberated for 35 minutes. 35 minutes to decide a man's fate, to weigh all the evidence, all the testimony, all the arguments. When they returned to the courtroom, their verdict was unanimous. Guilty. William Corder was guilty of the murder of Maria Marten. The judge, wearing the traditional black cap that signified a death sentence, pronounced William's fate. He was to be hanged by the neck until dead. The execution was scheduled for August 11, 1828. In the days between his conviction and his execution, William was held in Bury St. Edmunds jail. He was allowed visitors, and many came, driven by morbid curiosity, to see the condemned murderer. William, for his part, seemed to vacillate between defiance and despair. Sometimes he maintained his innocence, insisting that Maria's death had been an accident. Other times he seemed to accept his fate, speaking of his regrets, asking for forgiveness, preparing his soul for the afterlife. On the morning of August 11, 1828, William Corder was led from his cell to the gallows. The execution was public, as all executions were in those days, and the crowd that gathered to watch was enormous. Estimates put the number at 7,000 people, an extraordinary figure for a small town like Bury St. Edmunds. They came from miles around, farmers and shopkeepers and laborers, men and women and even children, all eager to witness justice being done. The hanging itself was quick. The executioner placed the noose around William's neck, adjusted it carefully, asked if he had any final words. William said something, but his voice was too quiet for anyone beyond the scaffold to hear. The trapdoor opened. William fell. His neck broke instantly, and he died within minutes. But the story doesn't end there. The treatment of William Corder's body after his death was, by modern standards, shocking and barbaric, but it was completely normal for the time. His corpse was taken to a local hospital and publicly dissected, an anatomical demonstration for medical students and curious onlookers. The dissection was meant to serve multiple purposes: advancing medical knowledge, satisfying public curiosity, and providing an additional element of punishment and humiliation for the condemned man. After the dissection, William's skeleton was preserved and eventually put on display in a museum. You could, if you had lived in 19th century England, have gone to see the bones of the Red Barn murderer, exhibited alongside other curiosities and specimens. But the most macabre detail, the one that seems almost impossible to believe, is what was done with his skin. Pieces of William Corder's skin were tanned like leather and used to bind a book. That book was a transcript of his trial, so you could, literally, read about William's crimes and conviction in a volume bound in his own skin. This practice, called anthropodermic bibliopegy, was not unheard of in the 19th century, though it was certainly uncommon. There are several documented cases of books bound in human skin, usually the skin of criminals, the idea being that this provided a fitting memorial or punishment for their crimes. By modern ethical standards, it's horrifying. But in 1828, it was seen as justice. The Red Barn murder became one of the most famous cases of the Victorian era. It inspired countless retellings in newspapers, pamphlets, books, plays, and songs. Street balladeers would perform songs about Maria and William, tragic tales of love and betrayal and murder set to catchy tunes. Traveling theater companies put on plays reenacting the crime, often with lurid embellishments and sensationalized details. Wax museums created tableaux showing the murder scene, the arrest, the execution. Why did this case capture public imagination so completely? Part of it was the sheer drama of the story, the vulnerable young woman, the deceitful lover, the prophetic dreams, the discovery of the body, the trial and execution. It had all the elements of a perfect tragic narrative, but there was more to it than that. The Red Barn murder highlighted deep anxieties about gender, class, and morality in early Victorian England. Maria Marten was, in many ways, the victim of the rigid social codes that governed women's lives. She had made mistakes, certainly. She had borne a child out of wedlock, engaged in a relationship with William Corder, trusted a man who was unworthy of that trust. But these mistakes, which today would be considered personal choices with no moral weight attached, were seen in 1827 as profound moral failings that marked Maria as a fallen woman. And once a woman was fallen, she became vulnerable in ways that are hard for us to fully comprehend today. She lost the protection of respectability, lost the assumption that she was worthy of consideration and fair treatment. William Corder exploited that vulnerability. He saw Maria not as a person with inherent worth and dignity, but as a problem to be solved. When she became inconvenient, when the ongoing complications of their relationship threatened to damage his reputation or his prospects, he decided the simplest solution was to kill her, and he very nearly got away with it because society's sympathy lay more with a farmer's son trying to avoid scandal than with a woman of questionable reputation. The case also highlighted how easy it was for someone to disappear in the early 19th century. There were no missing person databases, no forensic science, no coordinated police investigations spanning multiple jurisdictions. If William had been a bit more careful, if he had buried Maria somewhere more remote, if he had been more consistent in his lies, she might never have been found. The fact that she was found, that justice was eventually done, was due more to luck and to Anne Marten's persistent dreams than to any systematic investigative process. Now, let's consider for a moment how this case might have unfolded if it had occurred in the present day, in 2025, rather than 1827. The contrasts are stark and illuminating. First, Maria's situation would have been entirely different. There would be no social shame attached to her having had a previous relationship or a child out of wedlock. Single motherhood is common and accepted. Maria would have had access to support systems, social services, government assistance if needed. She wouldn't have been considered damaged or unrespectable. She would simply have been a woman with a past, no different from millions of others. Her relationship with William would also have played out differently. If she had become pregnant, there would have been options: abortion, adoption, raising the child with or without William's involvement. There would have been no desperate need for a quick marriage to avoid scandal because there would be no scandal. And if William had wanted to end the relationship, he could have simply done so. There would have been no need for elaborate lies or for murder. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that William still decided to kill Maria, perhaps out of anger or jealousy or some twisted desire for control. How would the crime have been investigated? Maria's disappearance would have been reported immediately, probably within hours. Her phone would have been traced, showing her last known location as the area around the barn. Security cameras, which are everywhere in modern Britain, would have captured footage of her movements. of William meeting her, possibly of them entering the barn together. When police searched the barn, they would have used ground-penetrating radar to look for disturbed earth, finding the burial site within hours rather than months. Forensic analysis of Maria's body would have provided detailed information about cause of death, time of death, any DNA evidence from her attacker. William's lies would have been impossible to maintain in the face of phone records, digital communications, and surveillance footage. The forged letters would have been obviously fake the moment anyone looked at the metadata or examined them with modern document analysis techniques. William's flight to London would have been tracked through his credit card usage, his phone, traffic cameras, and countless other digital footprints that we all leave constantly in the modern world. He would have been arrested within days, probably hours. And when the case went to trial, the evidence would have been so overwhelming that his conviction would have been certain. He might have received a life sentence, meaning a minimum of perhaps 25 to 30 years in prison before being eligible for parole. He would not have been executed. Britain abolished the death penalty in 1965, and there would have been no public dissection, no skeleton on display, no books bound in his skin. So in many ways, modern Maria Marten would have been safer, protected by technology and more enlightened social attitudes. But in other ways, the core tragedy would remain the same. A young woman would still be dead. A family would still be devastated. A community would still be shocked and traumatized, because while we have better tools for catching killers and better social support systems, we haven't eliminated the capacity for human cruelty, for people to see others as objects to be used and discarded, rather than as individuals worthy of respect and dignity. The Red Barn murder remains, nearly 200 years later, a powerful reminder of how far we've come and how much further we still have to go. It's a story of its time, rooted in the specific social conditions and limitations of early 19th century England. But it's also a timeless story about vulnerability and exploitation, about lies and truth, about how the powerless can be victimized by those with more resources and more options. Maria Marten deserved better. She deserved to live, to have choices, to be treated with respect and dignity regardless of her past. She deserved a society that would protect her rather than judge her. And while we can't change what happened to her in 1827, we can learn from her story. We can work to build a world where vulnerable people are protected, where justice is swift and certain, where no one is discarded or forgotten. So what do you think? If you had been in Thomas Marten's position, having those terrible dreams, would you have had the courage to search the barn? If you had been a member of William Corder's jury, would 35 minutes have been enough time to be certain of his guilt? And what does this case tell us about how we should treat people today, especially those who society might judge or marginalize? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below telling me what you would have done differently if you'd been part of this story. And if you found this deep dive into Victorian true crime fascinating, please hit that like button and share this video with anyone who loves history, mystery, and the strange true stories that sometimes seem too dark to be real. We bring you a new episode every single day here on Timeless Crime Files, exploring the murders, mysteries, and miscarriages of justice that have shaped our world. So make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on, because tomorrow we'll be back with another story from the past that still has lessons to teach us today. Until then, remember that history isn't just dates and names in textbooks. It's real people who lived, loved, suffered, and died, often in ways that should make us grateful for how much has changed and determined to keep changing things for the better.